Every year on this fourth week of Advent, the theme of love comes up. And I gotta admit, as much as I love love, sometimes it can be challenging because we also talk about love at weddings. Usually we read 1 Corinthians. We also talk about love often at memorials and funerals, and then at multiple points of the year. And so while I agree that it is nearly impossible to extinguish or exhaust talking about love, it is an opportunity on this fourth week of Advent every year to take a slightly different twist on it. If you were here last year, you know that I love homophones. These are words that sound the same, but are spelled different and mean different things. I actually keep track of these in my journal whenever one pops up in an email or in a conversation. I just love comparing words that sound the same but mean two different things. So I'm going to put a list of homophones that have come up in my emails in the past week. See and see. Click and click. Sight and sight. Flee and flee. Sweet and sweet. I just think these words are fascinating, and I love collecting them. But I'm always aware that during this Christmas season, when we are given the same four themes year after year, that one of the things we run into is that in English, the word love is used in so many different ways. And so sometimes it can be valuable to point out that in the Greek in which the New Testament is written, there are some different words for love. They all get translated into English as love, but these are 4 of the 8 Greek words for love. There are 4 of them we find in the Christian New Testament. Philia, from which we get Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. This is friendship love. Agape, which is overflowing love, often associated with God or the community of believers. Storge, which is like a steadfastness. It's a committed type of love. And then eros, from which we get erotic. I just would point out that there's a 5th Greek word for love that doesn't appear in the New Testament, but it's hysteria. So I think that's an interesting version of love. A lot of people don't know that that's a Greek word that can get translated love. So we have words that sound the same but mean very different things. And then we have some really diverse words that all gets translated the same way into English. By the way, if you are a note taker or like to know where we are in the progression, there are sermon notes at the end of every row in case you're interested in such a thing. But when it comes to love, one of the things I am very aware of is that for many people, they use it as a noun. And so it can be really beneficial to point out that it actually works better as a verb. That it's not an abstract concept somewhere out there, that love is an action. It's like hug. Like hug can be a noun, but hugs are much better as verbs, right? Love is something you do. And so for me, as I every year get the privilege, the opportunity to talk about love, one of the things I like to do is go on Spotify or Google and see if any new Christmas songs have come out this year. You know, they're always writing new ones or remaking old ones. And I also do the same for love. If there were any new songs about love, and I listen to some new ones and I check them out. But one of the things I am sort of feeling this year, and it might just be the season that I'm in, is there's only so much you can say about love. You know, between the poets and the songwriters and the preachers, it's been talked to death. There's not that much more to say about love. So my suggestion for us this year is that it's time to love. Not to talk about love or meditate about love or feel the feels of love, but to get down where the rubber meets the road and the tough work of love. To be the kind of people who prioritize putting love into action. And I mean this in a tangible sense for those we share a house with, which sometimes can be the toughest to remember to love. For our neighbors, in practical ways to think, what does it look like for me to love my neighbor? Our coworkers, our fellow students, our friends, and this city. This world really needs people who are committed to love. Because when love isn't a stated priority, if it isn't prioritized, the reality is it can pretty easily, by default, fall down the priority scale behind a whole bunch of other things, including one's self-interest and common beliefs and practices, or affinity groups, whether that is age or politics or, right? It can fall way behind things like being patient in traffic, or when it comes to issues of finances, and specifically taxes, and how it affects those who are less fortunate. If love isn't moved way, way up in our priorities, it's pretty natural by default for it to fall down the list pretty quickly. Love takes work. If we were a different kind of church, by the way, I would have you turn to your neighbor and say, love takes work. But we're not that kind of church, Jan, so don't do it. When it comes to the Christmas story, one of the most profound things that we get to rehearse and proclaim every year is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That the divine was birthed into the world through love, named Mary in this case. That a mother's love was a vessel of divine revelation that ushered in a new age that we call the kingdom, some call the kingdom. That love took on flesh and blood. That's an amazing thing to be able to say. That this concept, this abstract idea that often we talk about in such lofty ways when we talk about love, is actually a really dusty and sometimes dirty business of enacting, embodying. We call it, when we talk about Christmas, the incarnation. And that's an interesting word, because the carne in incarnate, the carne is the same root word in Latin from which we get a whole bunch of interesting words, including carne asada, incarnation. That's the meat. That's the flesh, right? That's the muscle of love. We get carnal from there. Same root word. Incarnation is when love takes on flesh and blood. That it is a business of skin and bone loving. It needs to be enacted. It is an action. It has to be embodied. Because there's no other way for love to be known than through these mortal bodies. It is incarnated, right? Like carnitas. It has to have meat to it. It has to have some enfleshment. These are an interesting set of words to be enacted, like a story put into place, acted out, enfleshed, embodied, incarnated. So my challenge, encouragement, exhortation to you is, there's not much more to say about love at this point. It's time to love. To actually get down where the rubber meets the road and love one another. For love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who doesn't love doesn't know God, because God is love. And at Christmas, that means love took on flesh and blood, was enacted. It was an action of love. It was embodied, what we call the incarnation. I'm going to ask Brenda to play us some music while we think about what might be an action we could take this week, or as we get ready for the new year, to love in practice, not just in word, but in deed. What's something we can do to show our love?